Okay, we are live, and today we are talking about chords, how to master chords as a songwriter, how to address some really key issues, some challenges that we have as songwriters, which is how do we come up with interesting chord progressions? How do we come up with chord progressions that suit the song that we're writing or set a mood for the kind of song we're writing? And how do we not get bored of our chord progressions? How do we find new and exciting ways to put together simple chords so that we can break out of some old patterns that we might be stuck in? So welcome everyone who's here on the stream. Delighted to be doing this at long last, and we've got a lot of material to cover. So great to see everyone, and let's dive in. So I'm going to be switching between the full screen guitar and a couple of slides that I'm going to talk you through, because the slides are really going to help us keep track of this process I'm going to walk you through, which is how to start with some basic chords and then move into some advanced territory by looking at the different combinations we can create with simple chords and different ways of playing simple chords. So why don't we start by looking at this. Two chord sequences. Two chord sequences, I think, are just such a great place to start because, first of all, there is so much music that is built on two chord sequences, these repeating patterns of two chord sequences. And as songwriters, they're a great place to start. They're a great place to start because they're simple, they're easy to make. We can really build a lot of complex sequences off the back of these two chord motifs, these two chord sequences that we bounce back and forth between. And two chords, moving back and forth between two chords, really allows us to establish a mood very quickly. And this is something that we're going to talk about in a lot of depth, because rather than just pick your chords at random, rather than just feel like, you're guessing at which chords go together, what we want to do is try and get some control over our chord choices, make deliberate decisions. And the reason you would pick one chord over another is because it helps you tell the kind of story you're trying to tell with the song that you're writing. So we want to talk about that, and specifically how to get the listener into a certain kind of mood. So let's talk about this idea of two chord sequences. And to begin with, best if we just talk about the chords that are in a key, diatonic chords, so that we can start selecting two chords out of the key and trying different combinations of those chords. So if we're in the key of C, for simplicity, and it is going to get fairly complex as we go along, but we'll just start simply here and talk about the fact that we've got the key of C laying out C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, back to C. And I know I just played a B full diminished instead of the triad. That's just a habit of mine. But yes, that's essentially the sound of those chords. So if we're going to start creating these two chord sequences, how do we get control over our choices, given that all of these chords work together really nicely? If I just select any of those chords and play them in a particular order, they're going to sound pretty good. So we've got a C chord. If I jump to the F, sounds good. To the A minor, sounds great. To the D minor, maybe back to the G, to the A minor, B diminished, and back to C. That all sounds great. And I wasn't really thinking about the order of those chords. I was just picking them at random. This is the power of diatonic chord sequences, the fact that they all belong together in a key and therefore sound pretty good regardless of the combination. You can pretty much jump around and pick any chord you like and it's going to sound great. But this gets us into trouble as songwriters if we keep using the same moves over and over and all of our songs start sounding together. Sorry, all of our songs start sounding the same. But the other problem is that if we're trying to create a particular mood and we're picking chords at random, sometimes we find ourselves creating a mood with the chord sequence we've chosen that isn't the mood we want. It's not serving the purpose of the lyrics or the narrative. So let's go and see how we can make these more interesting. Now, the first way we want to think about breaking up the diatonic sequence is by going into a little more detail and really separating out the away chords from the home chord. So if we're in the key of C, we're thinking of C as the home chord. There is only one home chord, depending on what key you're in. All the other chords are away. By definition, they're away from the home. So we get to use this to create some movement between the chords, but we also get to use it to create some different kinds of progressions, because we have the choice to either start at home and then go away, or start away and come home. And really, constructing interesting chord sequences is all about this game of starting at home, leaving home, coming back home, back and forth. That's where we create tension and release. That's how we create interest for the ear, by creating interesting combinations of these home and away chords. So let's do this visually and try and demonstrate what that sounds like. If we start with the 2 chord, I'm going to drag, if we start with the home chord and we drag the 2 chord down next to it. Now, this is a really nice sound. It's also the sound of the sequence moving up, because we're moving from one chord, the home chord, to the next chord in the sequence. So if we were to go back and forth between the C and the D minor, we've got the home chord moving to an away chord, back to the home to an away. But rather than think of it as random, what if we replace that 2 chord with the 3 chord and see what the effect is? Now we've got this. And you can hear that the 2 chord and the 3 chord, they have a different flavor. They've got a different mood that they're creating. And again, we're really just bouncing between these 2 chords at the moment, the home chord to an away chord. We can keep going up the sequence and say, what happens if we go from the C to the F chord? Now we've got the home chord moving to a major chord. The 1, the 4, and the 5 in any key is major. So we've got that classic 1 to 4 kind of sound, different than when we're moving to a minor chord. And again, it's creating a different mood. I think a lot of people think of the 4 chord as very hopeful. There's the 1, and there's the 4. So we can keep this whole pattern going. And again, we're doing nothing except toggling from the home chord, the C chord, to a new chord. Again, a different feeling. We've got 2 left. The A minor. Now the A minor is the relative minor in the key of C. And finally, the B diminished. And all of those sound pretty sweet. They sound nice together, but they do create a different mood when you go and replace whatever this chord is with one of the other options in the away box. So this is where we begin. We begin with trying to really get a handle on the different options in a key, the different diatonic options we've got to play with. And one of the things we didn't do then is actually reverse the order. We were always starting there with the home chord. And so often we feel we should start with the home chord. But one of the things I want to explore today is what happens when you pick another chord, one of the away chords, and make that the first chord that you start with. For example, if you started with an E minor and then went to the C chord. So now we're going away chord, home, away chord, home. Different vibe. And this narrative that you're creating with your chords is really important. The idea that we're creating a narrative or we're creating a story with the chord choices is important for us as songwriters because we're really comfortable with the idea of obviously creating stories with our lyrics. But what if the chords you're putting underneath the lyrics are telling a different story? What if they're telling their own story and there's a mismatch between the story you're telling with your lyrics? And an example of that might be if you're talking about something that's really stable and very solid. You're talking about a relationship that feels good and comfortable and everything's great. Well, then we can represent that with the home chord. That feels stable, and maybe we'll use the 4 chord to come back to the 1 and make it feel stable. But if we were to introduce some instability, that B diminished chord, if I'm saying something lyrically at that moment of the song, which is everything's great, I love you, we're together and we're great together, but that's the chord, that chord feels tense. It feels like it wants to resolve. And so I might need to be careful if I'm trying to say something very honest and sincere and grounded, but supporting that lyrical idea with a chord that doesn't feel any of those things. So this is where we have to consider the melody, the lyrics, and the chords, obviously, all together. All of this has to fit together and really create a cohesive whole as we're constructing a song. But today is all about chords and how we make our chord progressions more interesting. So we'll stick with that. So that's great in terms of the diatonic chords and breaking them up into home and away functions. Let's talk about the variables. And I'm calling these the variables because these really represent the checklist that I think we have as guitarists. If you write on piano, if you're writing on other instruments, you'll have your own checklist, and some of these will cross over. But really, this is a checklist for guitarists specifically. And I'm just going to run through them quickly and show you what each of them means, and then think about keeping these as a checklist next to you as you're working through your chords and your chord progressions or constructing a song on guitar, because they will help you create a lot of natural variation and a lot of contrast. So, inversion and form. Essentially, different inversions will change the stability of the chord and will give us different bass motion. So it allows us to create different bass lines if we're using different inversions. Different forms up and down the neck, they bring out different colors and different tones. So we'll talk about those in a second. We have the option of triads or extensions. Whenever we're talking about chords, we're thinking, do I want the simplicity of the triad, the directness of the triad, or do I want the extensions and the colors that they give me to paint with? We've got duration, harmonic rhythm. How long do we want to hold each chord? Without thinking about it, we often hold all the chords the same duration, a bar each. It takes sometimes a deliberate effort to interrupt that pattern and say, what if I hold this chord for twice as long? What if I hold this chord for only 3 beats? And we need to start to play around with these variations. Pick or fingers. In terms of rhythmic activation, are we activating the chords which are being created with the chord hand, in my case, the left hand? What is my right hand doing to rhythmically activate those chords? Am I using pick? Am I using fingers? Am I using different patterns, different styles? So that's a big variable. And finally, the 5th variable that I think should be on everyone's checklist is dynamics. Are we using changes in volume, changes in dynamics to really create contrast and motion and keep the listener engaged as this chord progression unfolds? So breaking down each of these and really talking about them as checklists for you to use. Let's start with inversions and form. Now, if we're talking about form, I think the cage system is probably the most comprehensive way to think about breaking down the guitar neck. The cage system stands for the C form, the A form, the G form, the E form, and the D form, which, if laid out on the guitar, takes us across all 12 frets before starting again. So if I were to play the C chord in these forms, there's the C chord. in C form. There's the C chord in A form. This is the C chord in G form. Then there's the C chord in E form. And then finally the C chord in D form. And that one's getting pretty high on the neck and it's quite bright. But you can hear the brightness of that is very different to this chord down here or this chord here. The warmth of that chord, totally different to this one up here. So having those different forms is going to give us different colors, not only a different arrangement of the notes in the chord, but using the guitar in different ways to elicit different timbral responses, different tones from the strings as we move higher up the neck. If we're talking about inversions, really great for a guitarist to feel or to know that we have a root position chord, which is going to be the most stable of the options. But then being able to go up to the third in the chord and play the chord off the third. Different sound and less stable than if we're playing it off the root. We also have the fifth that we can play in the bass. And that again, in this case, can thicken up the chord or change the tonality of the chord, but it's really there to provide a different bass option. So a simple C chord, if we just do a recap, has all of these variations just in terms of the inversion and the forms we can play. In terms of the forms, we essentially have those 5 forms. And then we have the ability to play them off the root, off the 3, off the 5. When it comes to triads and extensions, our next item on the checklist, we as songwriters, and especially songwriters who use guitar, we get comfortable with trying to pick up fingers or put down fingers to create interesting chord motion. So we can't compete with a piano player. A piano player has the full spread of 2 hands. They can create inversions and different, chord options that we don't have access to. So we've got to do the best with what we've got, which is essentially 4 fingers on this hand, trying to stretch and spread and get some interesting sounds. But even if we go back a step and just ask the question of when would we use triads and when would we use extensions, this is an important thing to think about. A triad is really direct, it's uncluttered. This chord here, this C triad, has 3 notes in it. And so it's really clear and uncomplicated. If we take this first finger off and introduce the major 7 note, we've now added a 4th note to the chord. And that chord, even though it's still a C major chord, the major 7 note does something. It gives us that extra little color. It makes the chord more complicated, more nuanced. We can also drop the little finger and create an add 9 sound. So now I'm bringing in the extension of the 9 because our extensions we're playing with are generally 9s, 11s, and 13s. Again, it's just another color. You can hear that C major is still in effect. It's still a C major chord, but we're adding these other notes on top of it to give it a little more richness, a little more nuance. What's also lovely if you're a guitar player is just taking those 3 chords there, the C major, the C major 7, and the C add 9, allows us to actually create melodic movement on top of the chord. So we can play this chord, put the finger down, put the little finger down to create the 9, and then go back. And if we're doing that as a rhythmic kind of pattern, it might sound like this. Really nice way to create movement just using the fingers that we have available in the form. You see there's very little movement of my hand. It's really just dropping or lifting up some of those other fingers. So that's a really nice way to get more bang for your buck out of a basic triad. The other thing we might want to think about are these 9s, 11s, and 13s. And again, they're just colors. So if we look at the A form and now switch to a C minor, for example, there's a C minor in A form. If I add the 9 to it, you can hear it's still the C minor chord, but that 9 is sad. It's beautiful. I think it's a really beautiful chord option if you're trying to create a sense of mystery or intrigue. The 11 asks a different kind of question. It's floatier. It kind of drifts along. It doesn't have the darkness of the 9. And then the 13, for me, is the most unstable. It's kind of got this edge to it, which again is so beautiful in the right context. But knowing that these are all C minor chords with just extensions added is really helpful, because as a songwriter, you're often looking for the one that has the appropriate mood or creates the appropriate mood. And for me, if I'm trying to create a jazzier kind of mood perhaps, or something with an air of intrigue or mystery, that might be the right chord. And you can of course move between these. That's a nice little move between the 13 and the 9. So the triads or extensions, a really important question that we can ask ourselves and put on the checklist. What about duration of chords? Duration of chords or harmonic rhythm, again, is that thing that we sometimes forget to address. So for example, that top line there, if we're counting in 4/4 of 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's often the pattern that we kind of get stuck in. You know, one chord for one bar, the other chord for a bar, and back and forth like that. But the 4th line, we've got 3 chords of C being held. What happens if we put this F chord down and just, again, only using the C and the F chord, but we're going to play the C chord for 3 bars and then move to the F chord for 1 bar. That might sound like this. And so it's almost like we're saying it's stable, it's stable, it's stable, we're at home, and then we go away from home just at the end of the sequence, which is again a different feel from alternating back and forth. Finally, with that 3rd line, we might choose to hold for half bars. So we're going to hold the F chord here for 1.5 bars, switch to the C chord very briefly for 2 beats, and then go back to the F chord. So this sends the message of being away from home, coming back home briefly, going away again. We're spending more time away than we are at home. 3, 4. 2, 3, 4, 2. Pick or fingers. Pick or fingers is one of those choices that will drastically change the tone of the instrument. It drastically affects how aggressive the chord activation sounds, or sometimes how gentle and tender it sounds. So if we're playing with a pick, the strum pattern is of course in play. The type of pick we're using is a factor, as in some people use very thin picks, very soft picks, other people use hard picks. That in itself will change the sound that people are hearing. But if we're just playing a C minor chord and I play with a plectrum, a fairly minimal plectrum, this is a, what's this, an 80mm nylon, you know. You can hear it's got an edge to it. Quite jangly. If I put my fingers down, sorry, if I put my pick down and go to fingers, then I'm thinking about my forward rolls, my backward rolls, my different combinations. I'm thinking about how I can start to, you know, finesse the strings in a different way. But again, that same C minor chord, finger picked, if I just do a forward roll and a backward roll. completely different mood. And I think more than almost any other choice you make, using a pick or using fingers will be a huge factor when it comes to creating a certain kind of mood. Certainly the pick gives you that edge and it allows you to create more volume in certain situations and so create a lot of energy. Whereas the delicacy of fingerpicking, and even if you're using fingers without fingerpicking but using it to create like a percussive strum, that can be a really nice way to set a groove without being too aggressive. For example, it's a different kind of vibe. I'm sort of using the palm of my hand as a percussive instrument. So pick and fingers, important decision that we need to make. And finally, dynamics. Dynamics is probably the most subtle of all the decisions that we need to make, but it is a deliberate decision to make. Because if we're strumming the chord at the same volume all the way through, or fingerpicking everything at the same volume, it really gives the ear an opportunity to detach and to drop off. And so it's one of those things that we can't leave until we get into the recording studio, or we can't leave up to the producer. This is something that we as the songwriters need to care about. And if you ever read classical scores, you'll see that they've got the dynamic markings written in to the score itself. It's a part of the composition. So instead of just strumming a chord the same all the time, if I was strumming that C minor chord, that's not going to be able to go on very long without it becoming, boring. So instead, we're looking for opportunities to maybe dig in on the first beat of each bar and then back off as the bar progresses. So heavy or loud, drop it off and back to heavy. And again, that push and pull, that tension and release, that dynamic change is one of those very simple and subtle things we can do that actually creates, a big impact for the listener. So there's the checklist that we're working through as guitarists when thinking about how to activate these chords. Picking the chord sequence is one thing, but how we activate them is a whole other thing. So let's now put that information into practice and see if we can start to come up with some interesting sounding chord sequences, even sticking with these two chord sequences. Just playing around with toggling back and forth between two, but using that checklist. And in this case, let's go from a C major and we'll go, I like the E minor. Let's go C major, E minor, C major, E minor. We'll go back and forth between those chords. And if we think about inversions, here's the first checklist. We'll think about form. Here's the first item on the checklist. Now, if I stay down here, it's going to be low. I'm leveraging the open strings. So there's the C and there's the E minor. Okay, what if we move up the neck a little? Now we're getting some brightness coming through. Maybe this C major here to that E minor there. So what if we say that's where we want to go, because we want the brightness of it. Do we want to stay with root inversion, or do we want to switch up to one of the other inversions? Well, we could say there's the C, there's the E minor. We could go from C over E to E minor. We could do that. For the time, we'll stick with root inversions. Then we move on to the second item on the checklist, which is, do we want to use triads or extensions? I think this is one of the ones that's really fun, because the basic triad, again, is beautiful. But what if we go with extensions or make the chords a little nuanced? What if we go with a C major 7 and we go to an E minor 13? Too much. The 13's too much. C major 7 to E minor 9, maybe. That's nice. Okay, so we're going C major 7 to E9, E minor 9. Okay, that's nice. Pick or fingers? Let's go, we'll go with fingers for the time being because I like the mood that they're creating. And then dynamically, do we want to try and treat one of the chords differently in terms of volume? Well, we could say that the first beat of each chord is the loudest. And create that kind of forward propulsion off the first beat. We also didn't talk about duration. So duration is one of those ones where if we're holding them for equal lengths, we might get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4. But we can change that up. We can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 3, 4, and that's nice. So we'll do that. That's an example of how the checklist can really be put in action very, very quickly, going through all 5 of those choices, but result in something that was more interesting than just finding the C and the E chord. And again, if I was down here, I probably wouldn't. Those chords with that finger picking, that kind of cluster pick pattern, don't sound, it doesn't sound as great. This feels more appropriate for that kind of sound. Whereas when we're up here, this is why the inversion or the form is so important. When we're up here, we've got a different tension on the strings. It's a tighter feeling. And so feeling. So that's step 1 in terms of a 2-chord sequence. And again, I think if we can master 2-chord sequences, it really allows us to build castles in the sky with our songs. It allows us to embrace all of these other chord possibilities. And we're going to dive into some borrowed chord possibilities in a minute and start to build longer sequences. But I think trying to get a handle on 2-chord sequences and make them as interesting as possible is such an important step for us as songwriters, because as you can see, if we force ourselves to not move from those 2 chords, it forces me as the guitarist to now think about interesting ways of activating those chords. I'm thinking rhythmically what makes them interesting. I'm thinking about dynamics. I'm thinking about the chord duration, all of those things we've been going through. And so that in turn creates for me a more interesting framework to build a song off. So even if I was just doing this, 3, 4, and it's getting there, but I would look to make that more interesting by maybe activating the E minor 9 differently to the C. So again, we're trying to create contrast between those 2 chords. So maybe it's and that finger picking again sets the 2 chords apart. Let's now talk about parallel systems. Now, I know that parallel systems, or maybe before we go into parallel systems, maybe we can actually talk about graduating on from 2-chord sequences and looking at what happens if we add a 3rd chord to this equation. So, toggling back and forth between these 2 chords, sorry. Toggling back and forth between these 2 chords, this is sounding okay. But the great thing again about creating a 2-chord sequence is that when you finally introduce a 3rd chord, it's a pattern break. It's a beautiful sound for the ear. So if we imagine that these 2 chords form our verse, these 2 chords going back and forth create the verse, then introducing a 3rd chord is going to sound fantastic. And I'm gonna bring this down here and pretend that this is a chorus. we've now moved to, or maybe no chorus, maybe just a different section. Even if I just do this, and introduce that F chord with the E minor still being prevalent. So imagine that this is our verse C major, and we're playing them as C major 7s, and we're playing the E minors as E minor 9s. And I'm going to keep that going for a second, and I want you to imagine that this is the verse. Now the ear is ready for something new, to the F. And back. Now all we've done is introduce one new chord, but the sequence sounds interesting, it sounds alive, because at a time when the ear needed something new, we gave it that third chord. And we are still staying very much within the diatonic sequence. We're using only chords from this key of C major, but we're playing around with making the 2-chord sequence interesting enough until it feels like we can't keep listening to it because it's too repetitive. Then we introduce a third chord and create the change. We could sub that F out. Let's sub that F chord out and bring in the A minor. And this time we might leave the F chord. So we've introduced 2 new chords now. We've gone A minor to E minor to F, back to E minor. Let's see how that sounds. Again, the ear would be getting a little, ready for something new at this point. To the A minor. To the F. You'll notice too that something I did there was choose different inversions of the E minor chord when I included it in the second line. So where I went A minor, E minor, F, E minor, instead of going to this E minor here, I chose a different form, this form here. Because again, I want to separate the 2 sections. If I'm thinking about the top line and the second line as 2 different sections, I don't want to use exactly the same inversion or the same form for both sections. I want to use the E minor and get the sound and the tone of the E minor, but I want the lower, darker version of it in the second line. And so this allows us, having those caged forms. If we just go back to the caged forms for a second, having these forms at your disposal is so useful. Even just there, being able to pick between that form there in the E minor and that form there. That E minor 9 and that E minor 9. That E minor 9 sounds like we're in a Western, Whereas that one's, it's jazzier. So we still haven't moved away from the diatonic sequence. We still are picking chords from the key of C. But now we get to drastically mess with it, because now we're going to talk about parallel systems. And parallel systems are a really great way to start finding chord progressions for anyone who's experimented with writing some songs or playing guitar and is comfortable with chords in a key, and they want to experiment with chords outside of the key, but don't know which chords to use. The parallel system gives you a lot of great chord options, and I'll demonstrate that now. So chords in the key of C are laid out left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've obviously got the 1, the 4, and the 5 as major chords. The 2, the 3, the 6, and the 7 are minor. What a parallel system is is saying instead of looking at the chords in C major, we're now going to also look at the chords in C minor. So the chords laid out in C minor look like this. We have C minor, D diminished, E flat, F minor, G minor, A flat, and B flat. So this is called a parallel system, and you get a lot of songs that actually create a parallel system at the beginning of the song, and then they'll blend chords between the two systems, or they'll borrow chords or pick chords from these two systems in parallel. And if you are trying to use a parallel system, I would very much encourage writing out both at the top of your page or in your Word document or wherever you're writing songs, so that you can visibly see which chords you have to play with, because being able to visualize them really helps sometimes not only identify which ones we've been using already or leaning on too much, but seeing what else is available for us to use. So if we go back to this idea of a 2-chord sequence, but this time we don't have to stay within the diatonic key of C, we can now take chords from either C major or C minor. So we can lay out the two sequences here and pick one from each, and it's easy to see because of the green and the black. So let's take the C chord and then pick one chord from, instead of going to the relative minor, for example, the 6th chord in the key of C, what if we take the 6th chord in the key of C minor? So we're going from a 1 to a 6, but we're using the 6th chord here in C minor, which is actually an A flat. And if we toggle back and forth between those, this is the sound we get. I'll play it here actually. Now this takes us into different territory. This is now giving the ear a different experience, because when we're going back to C major, again, I just want to make this clear from a sonic point of view. Any of the chords in the key of C major, if I jump around, your ear is going to be fine with them. It's going to accept them in whatever order we choose. It really doesn't matter, and we can you know, we can bounce around quickly or slowly. And it ends up fine. Again, just bouncing around, it's fine for the ear. As soon as we introduce this parallel system, that equation changes. That C chord to that A flat is so interesting, because the ear latches onto it and says, I know these are not from the same key, or something has happened where I'm being taken side to side between two systems. And of course, when listening to a song, the ear doesn't say, oh, I've just heard a parallel modulation or a parallel system in play, but it does know that something has just changed. So one of the things we can do that's interesting is actually take this A flat and really use it as a pattern break. What if we went like this? What if we went C, E minor, F, and then to the A flat? So imagine that's our chord sequence. And you can hear that we've got diatonic, 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 outside chord, C minor, chord from the key of C minor comes into play. The fact that it's in 4th position is important because the ear has had a chance to establish what it believes to be the tonal center or the key that we're in. It believes we're in the key of C because we are in the key of C. And then in that fourth chord, we get that little surprise. So if you're looking for a way to introduce an element of surprise in your chord progressions, this is a beautiful way to do it. And when you see it laid out, or when you see the parallel system laid out and realize you can select chords from each of them, it really makes the whole thing a lot simpler because chord modulation can be a complicated business. It can get people very confused. It gets called lots of different things, modal interchange, and there's fancy names for all of this kind of stuff. But rather than think too much about the theory, I'm a big believer in saying if you know how to lay out the chords in a key, and there's lots of different ways you can look for that. There's lots of different resources and videos on that. But if you can look at the chords in a key and lay out the two chord sequences together and pick and choose different options between them, this, I think, allows us to bypass a lot of painful and frustrating music theory. And as songwriters, we want to get to the part where we're writing songs. So let me just demonstrate what happens if we take that chord out of fourth position and now put it in, let's say, second position. We're going to switch the E minor and the A flat around. Now we're not getting a chance to establish the pattern. We're not getting a chance to hear three chords in a row that tell us we're in the key of C. We're going to get a pattern break early. Interesting. And a different experience. Now, one of the reasons you might want to try moving that A flat around, or whatever the chord is that you're taking from C minor, and try it in different positions, is because you may want to spotlight a particular lyric, or it may be trying to lock in with a melody, a particular melody note. So if you've got a particular lyric that you want to draw people's attention to, or a particular word in the line of lyric that you want to draw people's attention to, that A flat there in that position is going to really turn a spotlight on, and it might be a great thing to draw people's attention to that moment. Or you may feel that it was more appropriate to have it at the end because you want to create the pattern and then break that pattern. All right, let's try a different one. Instead of the A flat, let's try this one, the F minor. Now this 4 minor is a really beautiful sounding chord, and And again, if we just go back and forth between these two, it's going to sound like this. Beautiful sound. The 4 minor is a beautiful sound, but we can again do what we did before and say, I want to save that F minor and put it at the end. So now we're going to use the F, the naturally occurring F major from the C major, and we're going to use the F minor at the very end, which would sound like this. So there we're not giving away the F minor too early. We're saving it for the end. We can essentially keep playing this game of introducing chords from each of these parallel systems. Maybe we'll do it this way. Maybe we'll go one from C major, one from C minor, one from C major, one from C minor. We'll do that. Let's go with the B flat. Let's go back to a G chord, and then let's go to an E flat and see what happens. Now, interestingly, because we're doing this kind of like a game, We're just picking chords and trying them out in different orders, which I think is a really important thing to do and experiment with, especially if we're looking for new and interesting ways to arrange these chords. The thing about that sequence there is it didn't really grab my ear because it felt like it was jumping around too much. And what we're going to see here is that the bass motion feels a little bit wonky. So we've got the C going to a B flat, to a G, sorry, to an E flat. And that bass motion just doesn't feel great. Now, we could change that by going back to one of our variables, and one of the variables we had was which inversion do we want to play. We could choose to change the G into a G over B, except not question mark B. Oh my goodness. Typing and talking. G over B. We could do that instead. Now what this will allow us to do is go from a C to a B flat bass note to a B bass note and then to an E flat. So that's going to create a little more cohesion. So let's see what that sounds like. C to B flat to G over B to E flat. And I would say that everything was going great. I'll do it this way. I'm going to go C, B flat, G over B, and then I feel like the E flat is kind of ruining it. The E flat is just like, I mean, when I say ruining it, it's just a particular sound. It's quite tense and unstable and unresolved. That may be perfect for what you're writing. That may be the perfect chord. But because it's kind of just sitting there, we can substitute it out. We can now try going back to that A flat. Now we've got a descending kind of line going from C. I'm going to take that G out of the equation. We've got C going to a B flat, going to a G over B, because we changed the inversion of the G, to an A flat. Interesting. Now we may feel that A flat, again, this is all just about cause and effect. If we're putting together this sequence, do we hear that A flat and go, it's just too unstable. I don't need it to be that unstable. In which case, maybe what we want is actually another one of the chords from C major, sorry. So we'll go with the A minor chord from C major. Now we might have this. That's nice. So maybe just that one chord from C minor is enough for the progression. But whatever the feeling you're trying to create, there is going to be a combination of chords that gives you that feeling. And what I'm trying to show with this system is a way to really gamify the whole thing. A way to actually, have fun with it and look at the options you've got to play with and try substituting chords in and out and see what the cause and effect of that is. And you will often find that you stumble upon a chord progression that you've never heard before, or you've never heard it presented quite that way before. And, this for me is what keeps chord writing or writing chord progressions really interesting. The fact that we have all of these different combinations to play with, and some of them are very unique and some of them are quite jarring. And some of them are also going to create a lot of instability. But that's sometimes what we want. We want sometimes to create a lot of tension and then resolve that tension. I've noticed on the chat, I finally noticed on the chat, sorry, that took me a long time. I finally noticed that there's a lot of talk about this guitar. It's not a Martin. It is a Headway made in Japan, but it is, of course, modeled on a Martin Triple O, and it's it's a beautiful guitar, but it's not a Martin. And I'm saying that because I can notice there's a lot of people trying to work out what it is based on the headstock and the tuners. But yes, it's a Martin copy made by a Japanese company called Headway. So, mastering chords for me, again, is all about getting control over the choices I'm making so that I can start putting together sequences of chords that really help me tell the story I want to tell, or the song that I'm writing, and especially creating a mood that is interesting. So if we just go back to, this screen here represents, I think, the playground. Dragging in chords from either of these systems represents the place where I think you can have so much fun, because you're going to get these unusual sounds that are not predictable. And a good example of that is, let's start with an F chord. We'll start away from home. We'll go to a D minor, then we'll go to a C, and then we'll go to a G minor. Again, I love this idea of putting an unexpected chord in the fourth position. I just think creating, as songwriters, I think, this is such a great sound to build up an expectation and then, break it with that fourth chord. So we've got F, D minor, C, G minor. Now, if I'm going to use the checklist, I think it's important to just do what we did before and put this checklist into action, because you can see that to demonstrate these, I'm really just falling back on that, that pattern of playing them all the same duration. So holding the chords for the same duration, I'm playing them in their simplest possible form, which is down here in open position. And one of the things that's beautiful about this kind of chord sequence is again, just being able to interrogate what we can extract from it. I think if I played it like this, it would sound fine, but it's also a little bit boring to my ear. If we do something, let's open this up and go and play the F chord like that. Now, what I'm doing there, so people can see, is I'm actually, instead of a full F bar chord, I'm playing the F like that, and I'm letting the E string on top ring to create essentially an F major 7. But we can also take off the B, let the B note ring, and that gives it like a sharp 11 kind of sound. Now that chord there is really interesting. Again, predictable, direct, triad. Great because it's solid and it's a full sound. But that F chord, if you've been playing every F bar chord like that, or some people play them here, if you're playing every F chord like that, experiment with this one. Beautiful sound, really mysterious. The other thing to do is go, all right, well, there's an F, but here's a great F form here. And what I love about playing guitar is looking for opportunities where this little finger can really get to work. If it's hanging there, not being used, putting it to work and creating hammer-ons and pull-offs can result in this beautiful kind of melodic phrasing on top of a chord. So again, F, D minor, C, and G minor is what we're playing with. I'm still just playing around with the F chord. That one there is different to this. Okay. It's a little glassier, this one. But we've got this little finger. We can do this. you can see that as I was just getting into that, I'm starting to feel like that chord sequence is coming alive. It wasn't alive here when I was just doing it F, D minor, C, and G. It's coming alive now because I'm starting to activate it with different rhythmic patterns. I'm playing around with different forms, different inversions, and also thinking about the duration. But this, for me, is one of the most beautiful parts of experimenting with chords, these little melodies we can put on top. And that might be all I do, and then the C chord. Back to the G minor. That's D minor 13, too much. And so there, what you're starting to hear is a motif developing. So I'm going. So to break that down, the F to the D minor to the C to the G minor, I'm looking now for a melodic phrase that really sits on top of them and moves down. So what I'm doing there is with the little finger, I'm playing the F major as an F major 7, but with a 9 added. The D minor as a D minor 7 to a 9. The C as a C major 7, again falling to the 9. And then the G minor as just a straight G minor. And this for me is a beautiful moment when sitting with a 4-chord sequence, which I think is interesting, but not interesting in the first version, nor the second version, and possibly not even the third version. When melody and chords come together, you know, this is for me when it starts feeling like I'm writing a song rather than just messing around with some chords. So this here, we only got to this because we asked a few key questions. Which inversion or form should I use instead of just staying down here? How should I rhythmically activate it? Could I hold the chords for a different duration instead of just going 1 chord per bar? Maybe hold them for 2 bars, maybe hold the G minor for less time at the end. And then looking for this downward motion, you know. I really like that. Now, interestingly, I like this. And I'm not sure about the G minor. So we get to sub out the G minor for one of these other chords in the C minor, right? Let me just take off the G minor and let's try the E flat. Now let's try the E flat. It didn't work before in the sequence we were doing, but let's try this. There's something happening there. That's really quite pretty. Okay, so the chords would be F major 7 to a D minor 7, C major 7. That's nice. And then if we roll this back round, I'm going to try something now. I'm going to do this. I'm going to roll the A flat round to the G minor. I'm going to keep it falling to an F major and hold that and maybe go to an A minor. Now we're just messing around with chords from these two systems. But this is what happens. I get excited and I start wanting to write a song. So we've got F, D, C, E flat, A flat, G minor, falling to the F, and A minor. Now, let's try this again. Here we go. And we go around again. And I resolved on C. Now that progression is starting to take on a bit of a life of its own, and I don't want to give the impression that I would sit here and just play this game on paper. Once we start with one of these progressions, you don't have to sit there and constantly keep substituting chords in and out. At some point, it's fun to just look at the instrument, get your hands on the guitar, and really mess around with where else it could go. You know, that E flat going to that B flat might be another beautiful option because it's right there. So we could do that. Up on a G chord, which would pull us round nicely to the F. So the other thing that I'm looking for is what pulls us round nicely. What is the last chord doing that creates this nice return to the first chord of the sequence? And that's where I think when Kepi and I talk about this lyrically, we were just running a session earlier that was talking about this exact thing. Talking with some of our community members about the idea of power positions. This A minor chord here is a power position, and it's a power position because it's the last chord we're being left with in the sequence, and it's going to pull us back around to this F chord here. So the first and the last chord in a sequence are power positions because we're hyper focused on them in terms of how they reconnect. What I did just then is I actually took out that A flat and I put in a B flat. And then I think I put the A flat in. And then went to a G major. And the G major I held for two pulses. And so that felt good because the G going back to the F, the G at the very end, then pulling back around to the F, it just felt good. It felt like a nice cohesive way to get back to the beginning. So if we just recap this whole idea for a second, because I know in some ways there's a lot of information there, but I want to simplify it down to this basic evolution of an idea, which is firstly to start with a 2-chord sequence. And the 2-chord sequence should come from a diatonic system. Really get comfortable with playing around with taking 2 chords from the same key and feeling the effect of substituting out one chord for another. Understanding that the home and away function is really important, that if we're starting with a home chord, you know, sitting on that home chord, there's no tension. There's no need to move. That home chord can sit there for as long as you want and it's going to feel incredibly stable. But the moment we pick one of those other chords, the D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, or B diminished, we're going to have left home. And then it's about finding our way back home or choosing how long we want to hold that chord before we return home. So really starting by interrogating these 2-chord sequences is so important. And then the work of the guitarist, the work of anyone who writes on guitar or plays on guitar, it's this checklist here. And especially those inversions and forms, anyone who has been frustrated by only having one way to play a chord, the cage system, I've got another video on the channel breaking down the cage system if you're interested, but there's lots of different videos and resources around the cage system. If you are struggling with just the one way of playing a chord, the cage system is going to give you these other options. And that's going to liberate you from always having the same sounding F chord or G chord or whatever the chord is you're playing. So this checklist for me, these variables really represent the way you take very basic chord sequences and reimagine them and re-energize your playing and your songwriting through some interesting experimentation, including the inversions. And I would say that, you know, again, going through them all one by one is really helpful. We didn't really spend much time talking about picks because it just felt comfortable to play on fingers. I'm also aware that when I play with a pick, it gets loud and I generally peak the mic and it's not pleasant on the other end. But dynamics certainly are a factor there. So if you've gone through that checklist, those 5 things, that really allows you, after experimenting with those things on a 2-chord sequence, that really allows you to then come over to the parallel system and make the whole thing a little more complex by giving yourself all these new colors to paint with. And this is, I think, where you could end up experimenting with the parallel system for the next 20 years. There's so much material that can be created just with that system before we talk about other kinds of modulations. So hopefully that gives you a way to master your own chord progression writing and your own chord sequences. Happy to answer any burning questions that anyone might have while we're on this topic. So please, in the chat, I see there's lots of activity going on. If anyone's got a question, please throw it in there. And in the meantime, I'll just work on this for a second. That might be a nice way to do it, actually. I think that's going to be the sequence for a new song. That sounds good. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So good to see you. And hopefully I'll see some of you at the community. I know there's quite a few people from our community on there. Look forward to seeing you at the next weekly songwriting feedback catch-up. There's a couple of questions coming in. Okay. Do you separate lyrics and guitar, or do they get written at the same time? Lyrics and guitar. Oh, veggie soup. That's a good question. Well, I think that the answer to that question really is, if we're using chords, you know, this conversation has really been around chords. If we're using chords to create a framework to do our songwriting, then the chords are providing the background. So the guitar playing for me is kind of creating this framework that I can build lyrics on. So I would say that for that kind of thing, I would be looking for a melodic phrase, I think. If I was starting with chords, I'm looking for a melodic phrase and I'm looking to attach lyrics to a melodic phrase, rather than anything that the guitar is doing. So what could be a melodic phrase? Let's do this for a second. It's only So that might be it. That might be a nice melody. That's all right. That's all right. So there I've got to change the melody. Yeah. So I would say I'm looking for a melody and then looking for a lyrical idea in answer to that question here. It's only a hill that light. It's only a honest life. Ever goes around. Goes around again. That's the, I should mention that if we're in a key and then we throw in one of those chords from outside the key, that's the moment where the ear goes, oh, I've actually got to adjust the melody there. So it's like, you know, on around, right. Yeah, I would have to adjust that. And then I'm looking for lyrics off the back of that. Do you then drop the melodic phrase from the guitar playing? I do the same thing as the melodic phrase on the guitar. Yeah. I think being able to separate, it's such a great question. I think being able to separate the guitar from the melody, you know, the guitar is there as a tool to create a background for you to write a song with. So here's a good example. There's a melody of, and if I'm not careful, I'll want to mirror that or mimic that with the lyrics. Now, the other way to approach it is to say, maybe that is the melody. And I play it on guitar first as an intro and then use it as the melody for the lyrics. So if we go, imagine this is the intro of the song and we're playing it. And then we're going to go, make that the lyrics, but don't play it on guitar. So you might do that and replace the melody line you're putting on top of the chords with the with a sung melody. That can work. That can work. But I'm generally challenging myself to try and come up with more melodic material. So if that's the melody on guitar, I'm looking for, there's a road and almost trying to find a gap. So if that's the melody, maybe waiting till the lyrics come in. You know, something like that, where it's almost like a call and response between the melody on the guitar and the melody that's being sung. Again, we're pretending this is a written song, but this has just come up in the last 10 minutes. This is the beginning of an idea with no real direction yet. But I think even as we talk about it, keeping that melody in the playing of the guitar and then finding space for a second vocal melody, I think that would be a nice approach. But in honesty, done on our way, and there we go. Something like that, I think would be nice. Kind of a little bit of overlap, but not treading on each other's toes. Yeah. What are we saying? Yeah, so the sound doesn't lead itself to wrecking your truck and losing your dog. Oh, it's so good. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I'm mumbling nonsense at the moment. I'm doing that whole top lining thing where it's just like, but you know today, and there's no real, you know, there's no meaning there. But in the process of mumbling, it's amazing how often we find actual words come out. When you find a way. So like when you find a way is a line that's just there, right? It's just coming out of the mouth. When you find a way, there's no other. And so when you mount the star, when you ride a roll, I'm gonna keep on. Yeah, I'm now just trying to see where I think my instincts would take that melody, but it's certainly about, I certainly prefer the idea of, if I'm writing something on guitar, not getting in the way of it too much and finding space for the melody and the lyrics to exist around the thing that's been created. Because the other thing, is that's quite busy. Yeah, that's quite a busy pattern. So I've got to find a simple melody that weaves, or a simple lyrical line that weaves, throughout. So what if you have a melody and you're trying to fit chords into it, or having trouble doing so? Yeah. Loop that and go to town. Yes, this will stay on YouTube, by the way. Great question. So we've got the other question there of what happens if you've got a melody, you're going the other way and you've got a melody and you're trying to fit chords around it. Let's go. We're in the key of C. Well, I'm going to answer that by demonstrating. Oh, sorry. Barry asked a great question. Can any chord next to another feel resolved? Can any chord next to another feel resolved? That's such a good question. Can any chord next to another feel resolved? I've just got to process that and how to think about that. Well, yes. Yes is the answer. Let's go back to the chart for a second. Let's say we're in. I mean, it's interesting because if we go C and go to a chord that feels less resolved, I would say that G chord straight up to the A flat is going to feel resolved. So we're going to start with the C chord, go to an A flat, and then go to the G. And then we could loop back around to C. But we could also, we could go, this might be a cool sound. Let's go F minor. I think one of the really nice things about going one from C major, one from C minor, back and forth, is it creates this kind of tension and resolution so that the next chord is going to be the thing that resolves the tension, and then you ramp it up again and then you fall back. So it's sort of like if we went C major, if we did this progression, it's almost like it's almost like the full sequence resolves itself. But yes, any chord we put there where the green chords are can be resolved by the next chord. Now, if we put two green chords next to each other, what if we do that? What if we do that? Because if we try this is going to be interesting. That sounds great. So we had two chords there from C minor together and they sounded great. If we put the E flat there, again, another great. This is like rapidly testing just different chord options, but all of these are working really nicely to create interesting chord options or chord sequences. We could use any of these to write a song with. So I think Barry, yes, that question of can any can any chord next to another feel resolved? I think the answer is yes. It's just a matter of how you resolve it. And some chords, you know, some chords have, we can make, like we can put a G minor. What if I put a G minor here? Now we're just playing. If I put a G minor in there, but I put a G, like a G minor 6 kind of sound. Like that chord is a really, that's a pretty tense chord. That's a G minor 6. I'm going to put a B natural in it as well. That is a tense chord. So if we start off with a C chord and then go to that G minor 6 kind of vibe, I think even if we toggled back and forth between those two, that would be a fascinating sound. But note how dark it is. It's like it's really dark and unsettled and brooding, but it could be the perfect platform for a dark, brooding, unsettled kind of song. So, you know, there are no limits to how much tension you can create, you know, with some of these chord options. Now, just back to that question, I just want to demonstrate that question that was asked before. We're starting with chords here, but what if we start with a melody? If you're a guitarist, one of the best things you can do, I think, is to pick a note, pick a single note and pretend that's your melody. If we pretend that's your melody, just a single melody note for a minute. That's an E note. Now, what's great about knowing that that's an E note is we go, well, how many different ways can we put a chord around that? There's a C chord where the E note is the third of the chord. What if we play an A minor where the E note is the fifth of the chord? What if we play a D9 where the E note is the 9 of the chord? To a G7 or a G13 where now the E note is the 13. And then we can keep going. We can sort of play a C sharp diminished where it's also in the chord. So what I'm demonstrating with a one note melody here is that we could go, imagine we've just simplified a melody down to one note. Looking at all the different ways you can put those chords underneath it and reharmonize that melody note is again a really powerful thing for a songwriter to think about. So that's how I think of harmonizing melody, by simplifying it down to, you know, one note and then going, all right, what are all the different ways I could put a chord underneath that and reharmonize it? And then if you've got obviously a melody that's not one note, which most melodies are more than one note, you kind of do the same thing, but you're now playing with more notes. So if the melody was even just that, now I can't play that note anymore because I'm not just holding an E note. Now I'm looking for where am I changing the melody note to change the chord. So say that's the note there. That's the melody note I want to end on. Now I'm looking to harmonize that note there. And it's a different proposition. So I've got to change the melody note there because I went to a different chord. So it is one of those things where I think getting used to doing this with a one note melody and then expanding to a 2 and a 3 note melody teaches you what harmony options you have to play with. And also when you land on a chord and you have to adjust the melody note. For example, if we go C major to A flat, one from C major, one from C minor, That's a great moment where it's like, I can't hold that note over that because instead of the E flat is in the A. So instead, my melody note would go down a semitone. That would be, that would be something, an adjustment that the melody note has to make. Trevone saying, if you've got a progression, when you've got a progression figured out like you were working out before, what dictates how you make up your chorus from that point once you have a starting point? It's a great question. It's a great question. If we're thinking about sections, look, one of the great ways to write a chorus, again, this is something, because we do song feedback sessions as part of our community and we do them every week, like we get to hear so many new songs, which is great because you hear all of these different songwriters writing all of this different music in different styles and genres. And so you sort of start hearing the patterns across all of these different styles. And one of the patterns you often hear is people trying to create contrast or not creating enough contrast between their verses and choruses. So if I was trying to create a verse section, one of the first things I'd do is consider leaving out the home chord that I want to land on, right? So if I want the C chord to feel really strong, if I want the chorus to feel strong and powerful, using the tonic, the home chord, in the chorus at the beginning of the chorus is a great way to declare the strength and the solid feeling that gives in the chorus. So that means we put it down here in the chorus and go, great, that's going to be, I'm going to go 1 to a minor 4. That's going to be, pretend that's my chorus. That's going to feel like a great chorus. It's going to go. That's going to be great. So that means if this is a verse up here, I'm going to try and maybe avoid using the home chord in the verse. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go A minor, F, maybe D. I might make this actually. No, I'll just use the F. I won't overcomplicate it. So I would try and potentially avoid using the C chord, the home chord, the tonic chord in the verse. So my verse might sound like this. And then it's going to repeat to the F chord, to the D minor, to the F chord again. Now we go to the C chord for the chorus. And that, very simply, without doing anything else, is a really great way to declare this is the chorus. This is the part, that contains the central message of the song, because we've avoided it in the verse. We've avoided using it, or you might use the C chord very sparingly. You could still use it, but I would put it maybe there. So it's going A minor, F, C, F. But I'm certainly not using it in first position, this power position here at the beginning of the chorus. That I'm going to save for the home chord to declare it as the chorus. So that's one way to do it, But yeah, it's one of those things where we're looking to create, we're looking to send a signal to the listener that this is a new section and that there's some dynamic changes and harmonic changes, and the whole thing is progressing and moving forward and getting more and more exciting. That's what we're trying to do with our chord choices throughout the sections. Yeah. I was going to ask the same question. This is what about the bridge with the C minor chord, heavy pattern, make a good bridge. Oh yeah. So then the bridge comes in, and we're like, oh, what? Like, imagine this is the song we're writing. Imagine this is the song we're writing. Here's the verse here. A minor, F, C, F. So we're really avoiding the C, except we've buried it in the middle. Then we use the C at the start of the chorus. And then we get to a bridge, and we could go, oh, time for a parallel modulation. Time to lean on the C minor sound, and then we go C minor. We could make the whole bridge in C minor. Wouldn't that be cool to sort of come out of a chorus which is going C, F minor, C, F minor, and then we get into a bridge and we go C minor, A flat, and then switch back to the chorus, C major. That would be really cool. That would be a really nice way to use this parallel system. Yeah. Creating a chord progression with triads sounds weak sometimes. Do triads need more bass or fuller sounding chords to sound more? When you say weak, Barry, what do you mean by triads sounding weak? More bass or fuller sounding. I'm trying to work out what you mean when you say weak. I mean, do you mean in sound? I would say that triads. What's beautiful about triads? Just not as full maybe. Well, no, I don't. I think what's an important distinction between triads and chords with extensions is like this chord here is a triad. I'll come back up here. This chord here is a triad. It's a C major triad, but it's a full bar chord. And I think that sounds really full. This is a C major 7, and this is a C major 9. They're all kind of as full as each other, I feel, but I'm just adding different colors to them. But that C major 7 there, or that C major triad, or here, can sound really, really full. It just sounds less complicated. It's less complex because there's less notes in them. I would say this, this C chord here with a G in the bass, this C over G, is probably the fullest sound you can get on guitar. Like, I don't know if that's peaking the mic, but that's so rich. So I think that triads can be incredibly full, but yes, I think you've got to, with all the sounds on guitar, you've got to voice them or activate them in a particular way to get the fullness, if that's what you're looking for. I mean, you can also make them sound really, you can make them sound really small and like that, Yeah, because sometimes you don't want it to be too big. You want it to be delicate, so you can hear all the notes being articulated. Yeah, like if you're playing, I will say if you're playing triads up high, Barry, like that D chord there doesn't sound particularly full because the lowest bass string there is the D string, which is the 3rd string, and it's pretty thin. As opposed to this D chord here, or this one here, So I think it is about which form you're using and which inversion you're using and how you're activating it with the hand, with the right hand. Yeah. But also, I think, bass motion, like if I'm playing, there's a, that's a classic sort of, they're all triads, but they're quite full because they're all having the bass string activated, by the thumb. It's doing a lot of work in that situation. Okay. So many great questions. Thank you so much. Warwick, much appreciated. Any other questions before I wrap it up? Okay, well, I want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining the stream, asking some great questions. Hopefully that's helpful, and more importantly, hopefully you get to write some songs that you're happy with that information. This is the kind of information that we go over every week in the songwriting community. If you're interested, please check out the links on our channel, and you can find your way there. And we love nothing more than hearing people's songs, original songs, and talking through them each week in our feedback session. So thank you again for all the great questions, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone.